Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, warmly welcome to our session on putting girls and women at the heart of conservation and climate action. Before moving on to the discussion that we will have this afternoon, a few housekeeping issues. Hopefully all of you have downloaded the European Development Days app and follow the Development Days on Twitter. For those who want to tweet from this session, please use the handle EuropeAid. And the hashtag for the event is hashtag EDD18, as well as SheEDDs. And do also tag the global online campaign SheIsWe in your tweets. The hashtag is hashtag SheIsWe.
I don't know.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we all know that gender equality and women's empowerment lie at the very heart of achieving sustainable economic growth, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as meeting the Paris Agreement targets that we have set to ourselves and that our countries have set to themselves. So government, businesses and civil society at the moment, pretty much everybody, are looking into gender-responsive solutions to ensure that the major development challenges of this world will be met. In our panel discussion today, we have some of the key players representing the key organizations that can actually get things done, both for women and girls, as well as for climate and conservation. Let me quickly present our panelists today. Lorena Aguiar is the Global Senior Gender Advisor and Director of the Global Program on Governance and Rights at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Lorena has established an IUCN Global Gender Office as well as many influential international gender networks. Randy Davis is the Director of the Gender Team at the United Nations Development Programme. She's running a team of 170 people who advise governments around the world on gender issues and lead a global initiative called the Gender Seal Certification Programme that encourages private and public enterprises to meet gender equality standards. Jonathan Taylor is the Vice President of the European Union's own bank, the European Investment Bank. The bank is the world's largest multilateral lender and the biggest provider of climate finance. In addition to being a Vice President, Jonathan also leads the bank's work in climate action and circular economy. Shah Chowdhury is a youth representative from Bangladesh with science studies background. Among many projects that Shah has implemented in Bangladesh, let me mention the project Krishna. It is a social venture giving access to safe drinking water all over Bangladesh, utilizing the platforms of youth engagement and corporate social responsibility. And the final panelist is Rabia Faruqi. She's a director at the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and a member of the Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition. Rabia has worked around the world in the fields of energy development and environment. So this is our panel today. Before I start firing my questions at them, let me ask you all to take your mobile phones and use the app to reply to the following questions. True or false? Gender equality is crucial to solving the climate change crisis. Also, in how many countries do women and men have the same legal rights to land? And then the final question, the questions will come up on the board, but I'll read it out for you. All major international environmental agreements have gender action plans. And while you contemplate your replies, let me ask Lorena to prepare the first question. You represent the International Conservation Union. Why is it important to your organization to co-host a session like we're having today? And can you explain us what does the environment have to do with women and gender equality? And I believe after our audience has gone through the questions, you will also have something that you want to show us, basically to answer the questions that you are trying to find solutions for.
Yeah, do they know already that they're going to get a free coffee if they get all the questions right? So, well, thank you very much for helping us host this event. IUCN took the challenge more than 24 years ago to create a gender program. And it was a massive change. No other international environmental organization of the size of IUCN embraced gender equality and women empowerment. And believe me, it was not easy. It was not easy because at that time, the knowledge of linking gender and protected areas and gender and biodiversity and the beginning of climate change was not there. And being an institution based on knowledge, we had, the first challenge was to generate that data and that knowledge to make the point. And very soon in IUCN, we understood that bringing together the majority of the environmental organizations, because IUCN is an umbrella organization with more than 169 countries that are members, we have a tremendous power to advance this process. And we always said how we were going to miss 3.8 billion people from the solutions that the world needs for climate change, biodiversity conservation, our coast, our mountains. So IUCN took this great challenge, and I think we have done a little bit of an improvement in the past 24 years in this topic.
Randy, I'm sure that we all agree that gender equality and women's empowerment are absolutely necessary and also form the foundation for any peaceful, prosperous and sustainable world. Many countries have, most of the countries have actually committed to sustainable development goals as well as to the targets of the Paris Agreement. Can you tell us a little bit more from the United Nations Development Programme's point of view, how are gender and climate goals interlinked, and what can be done from your point of view to reinforce, to make kind of each of these fields, the gender empowerment as well as climate change, to reinforce each other?
Sure. First, let me correct the opening, because I wish I had 170 people that work for
okay.
me. We have 170, we work in 170 countries around the world, and everybody that works for UNDP is doing their effort to mainstream gender in their work, like all of us who are here today are doing our bit. I wish I had more gender expertise in my team, but I think we're a very committed organization.
I was getting very jealous of your.
You were jealous, I know. I'm sure that
people.
everyone was jealous there.
That was a subtle hint to hire more people to work for.
I'm more than happy. But I also just want to take a moment to recognize that IUCN was really one of the pioneers in bringing gender into this discourse around climate change. And together with IUCN, UNEP, and WIDO, we formed a global gender and climate change alliance. I don't want to, 10 years ago, it was quite some time ago, to really bring women's voices and gender equality issues into the discourse around climate change and environment. And I think as a result, we now see that the Sustainable Development Goals and other global agreements really recognize the interlinkages between achievements of gender equality and addressing our climate goals. And one of, maybe I just would stress a few of the areas where they intertwine. One is certainly when it comes to reducing the care burden that is often, or more often, the challenge that women face in advancing in all of their rights. And we know that as climate change impacts the distance girls have to go or women have to go to collect water or firewood, or as their land becomes less productive in terms of yields, this has a major impact on their burdens of care. Conversely, when we know that we can engage women in climate adaptation, climate mitigation strategies, we not only achieve gender equality, but we are more likely to achieve better outcomes on the climate. And I'll end on just sharing some statistics on that. We know that women are 43% on average of the agricultural workforce, but this goes up tremendously, actually, in some regions. So if we could achieve equality in terms of their access to information, inputs, land tenure, land rights, we would see a considerable improvement in terms of land use and engagement of them in climate adaptation. Similarly, when you consider that they make up 2/3 of the world's 600 million small livestock managers, we cannot afford anymore to have a gender-blind approach, or one that doesn't take account of the roles that women are playing in these important fields that impact the gender goal, the climate goal, the food security goal, and the poverty goal. So we see at the UN that addressing gender equality is an accelerator across the full spectrum of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Jonathan, you're a banker and you represent the world's largest multilateral borrower and lender. Listening to these international institutions here, what does a banker feel like? Why has a financial institution like the European Investment Bank started to promote gender equality in the context of your own climate action objectives?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Indeed, thank you very much for inviting me to participate at this event. In particular, thanks to the IUCN, UNDP, and UNEP for organising all this. And the answer to your question, as far as my bank is concerned, is a relatively easy one, which is that we are a policy bank. Our objective is to lend in support of policy action and agreed policy action. And the European Union, after all, is fully supportive of the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the Sustainable Development Goals relates to gender. It is vitally important, therefore, that we support that. That's the glib answer, and it's not anything like a sufficient answer. The bigger answer, I think, is, of course, that it is right to do it, but that this also ties in with the achievement of other Sustainable Development Goals, which we are committed to supporting, including, in particular, the Climate Action Goal, but many others too, for exactly the reasons that Randy has actually just described. First of all, climate action impacts particularly on, so the negative impacts of climate action can be particularly hitting women and girls. We need to think about ways of dealing with that, and we need to be taking that into account. But more importantly, in terms of delivering the policies which we need to deliver to get beyond that, we need to harness the power and strength of women and girls to take that forward. If I can steal a line which Amina Mohammed used earlier on, why on earth are we allowing ourselves to tackle all the Sustainable Development Goals while using not 100% of the assets available to us, but only whatever it is, 50, 60, 70% or whatever. And by assets there, she meant gender equality, of course. We need to be moving forward in that way in order to deliver that. And that's why we are factoring gender strategy. We've developed a gender strategy, and we're factoring that into the individual project assessments and the support which we are providing across the piece. And I'm happy to give you some more details of that later.
Okay. Interestingly, you mentioned the figure as well, that why would we only be using half of the resources? This is what Warren Buffett said famously, that it is astonishing how well the United States of America have actually done, considering that they've only been using half of their resources, referring to the lack of women, and especially in the business and banking sector. A quick note to the audience, feel free to use your apps also to pose questions to our panelists. I will be coming to them when we finish the first round. Shah, we've heard now politics and the big institutions talk. You're the one doing the walk. You're a student activist and social entrepreneur who gets things done at a grassroots level. What made you commit to ensure that women in your native Bangladesh are engaged as change agents for battling climate change? Tell us a bit about your enterprises there.
Work and everything. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm a designer of social change, which at times means that most of the times I face a lot of challenges when implementing unorthodox ideas. When I was starting Project Krishna, people didn't believe in me. I went to different companies and corporates asking for partnerships, but nobody was willing to partner up with me or invest in me. But I believed in this project with all my heart, and with just around only $50 in my pocket, I implemented the first system in 2015. Now, the project has over 50 corporates supporting it, and has provided access to over 6 million liters of clean drinking water for free. And most of these corporates are actually run by women entrepreneurs. We've recently also started a newer model of Project Krishna, where we're training rural women in flooded regions to use filtration technology to convert flood water into drinking water and sell it in their community markets. Now, people may ask, why empower women from the environmental point of view? Now, I will ask this question. When a natural disaster like flooding strikes, who do you see walking for over 10 miles to collect that one single bucket of clean drinking water? It's not the men, it's mostly the women. See, we all believe that women, like this woman group, are the most vulnerable to climate change. But what we do not realize that they're actually the solution to it.
Exactly.
In terms of climate change, they know more about it, about all these environmental disasters that are striking, than anyone else present in this room, because they've come face to face with it. And we need to harness that energy and that knowledge from them as well.
Exactly.
That's why we're working towards the cause. But still, this is a big problem, because according to the FAO, only 10% of rural women in Bangladesh actually enjoy employment. Imagine that gender gap and how much potential we are losing in terms of environmental and climate action. Imagine empowering that 90% of women right then and there and seeing the results. Because when we provide one device to one woman, she can basically create the access to clean drinking water for her entire community. Imagine if thousands of women are empowered in that same way. And that's how we are basically working towards climate action. Because we believe that empowering women is the main solution to climate change.
Speaking of empowering women, Rabia, you work in a field of energy and renewable energy, and energy field or industry is notoriously male-dominated. Can you share with us your thoughts and tips after having listened to other panelists? How would you increase, and how do you see the increasing of women's participation, especially in the field of energy? Renewable.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. And I represent IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. So part of our work is easy because renewables are more sustainable, and so we automatically have a sort of a comparative advantage when we start dealing with energy solutions. So I'd like to take the perspective of achieving SDG 7 on energy, and how basically increasing women's participation can influence the pace, but also the sustainability of this energy transition that we're going through, with greater solutions in renewable energy, but also energy efficiency, and how empowering women in different contexts will help this sustainable path. So that's why it's very important for us to differentiate between the modern energy sector and what we call the access context, which was just mentioned now in terms of empowering women in different rural areas, for example. So in the modern context, what we have done is figure right away, which is what you mentioned earlier in terms of data and what availability, we figured out that there's very little data on employment itself before looking at gender. So we early on, 5-6 years ago, started working on job estimates in the renewable energy sector, and we found, we just came up with the last estimate, which is about 10.3 million people working in renewable energy, and it's not little, it's about 25% of the working force in energy in general. Of course, we also are estimating the future. So we were forecasting that this could go up to 30 million people in 2050. And if you add energy efficiency, there's 50 million additional jobs potentially in the sector. This is a huge pool of labor requirements over the next 20, 30 years. And we need to get ready for it. So introducing women obviously increases the pool of talent and skills that are required to support the sector. And at the same time empowers women through getting incomes, jobs, etc., while meeting the constraints of climate, right? Through more sustainable solutions. Another very important aspect in the modern sector is that a lot of studies are showing that women tend to be more sensitive to certain to social inclusiveness. They tend to be also more to be better environmental managers, to be more collaborative, etc. And a very interesting study that just came out from Ernst & Young on power and utilities in the world companies show clearly that gender diverse companies tend to outperform those that are not as diverse. So, and that's return on equity. It's not just some qualitative measurements, it's return on equity. So that's for the modern sector, and there are many other aspects that we can talk about later. Now, as far as the access energy context is concerned, there the interlinkages with other SDGs are even, more important, more crucial. And ensuring gender and social inclusiveness is very important for policies and projects. And again, enhances the pace and the sustainability of the energy transition and energy access efforts that we're all making. We have solutions in renewable energy that are decentralized and local, which helps increase the opportunities with to link those solutions to productive end users. So by improving livelihoods, welfare, many of the solutions are targeted towards ultimate development. Just to give you an example, we have a lot of projects on empowering women entrepreneurs through training and supporting productive sectors with active participation of women, and therefore women creating jobs for women. So that's your SDG 8 in terms of jobs, enhancing well-being, SDG 3 in terms of health and solutions in health centers, for example, but also education. And to finish, one very nice example that we just disseminated a little bit through an experience that was done in Indonesia to what is called the Wonder Women Initiative, where women were trained, 560 women were trained as social entrepreneurs, and they have sold more than 22,000 clean energy technologies. And a survey that was carried out about 12 months later shows very nice improvement in terms of the SDG, the other SDG interlinkages. Like 26% of them fully learned how to run a business. 20% became more empowered in their families, but also in the community with greater regard to their decisions or their how shall I say, their voice. And half of the respondents felt that their self-status had improved, also that their status in the community. And finally, I think that's an important one, the revenues that they gained were reinvested in self-education, but also greater spending in education for their families. And then we can talk about other aspects maybe later on. Thank you.
Thank you. I just got the message that you didn't have time to answer the second question, so this is also a test whether you've been listening to anything that our panelists have just said, because they've actually given you the answer. So the second question, if we can have it on the board, in how many countries do women and men have the same legal rights to land? That was one of the questions that you didn't have time to answer. So this also gives our panelists the possibility to catch their breaths before we scoot to the second round, starting with audience questions. But we'll wait for that. You'll also see it in front. There we go. Does it give us the answer? Here we are.
I think they saw the data. Yeah, that's the problem. They show the data before. That's good.
And should we go to the third question as well? True or false? All the major international environmental agreements have gender action plans. True or false? And if any of the panelists wants to comment this, feel free.
Mm-hmm. Have they answered?
Not yet. A few seconds. Now.
It's true. It's true. I mean, that is one of the things that we have been doing, working precisely with the major international environmental agreements to bring gender into them. 10 years ago, it was false. Right now, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Dry Lands, and Ramsar they all have gender action plans and gender policies in place. So for the first time ever in our history, we have all the MIAs that are called with very clear mandates, and a lot of the work has been done by people that are sitting here, that we created great collaboration to achieve that.
There's a question from the audience, and whoever feels most comfortable in answering can start. It can take years to change mindsets and societal structures, meaning that gender equality will not be an overnight achievement. When climate change is so urgent, how can we get women involved, breaking down the barriers to this in such a short amount of time? That is not an easy question. Who wants to start?
Randy or?
Maybe my comment would be because it's so urgent. We're seeing in some circumstance where it's even more urgent and so present and so obvious, that is where women are getting involved. That's where, your society is confronted with a problem it needs to solve. And if we're there as the external actors reinforcing that, and we have this fantastic global framework, I wouldn't say it's enough, but by all means it's just the start. And really the challenge that we have on our side is to implement what we've agreed. But in countries that are affected by devastating impacts of climate change, you are seeing that it is women who are there. Either it's in reconstructing after devastation or sustaining communities in a zone that has been affected by climate change. And they are assuming those leadership roles. It's our role to recognize the roles that they're doing that already, not to undermine it by reverting to traditional patriarchal structures. So it's already there, and our role is to invest and support it.
Can I quickly ask Jonathan? Well, you were raising your hand anyway, but how do you see it in the corporate world, the banking world? Have the paradigm shifted after the Paris Agreement, for example? Are people more ready to embrace gender?
Well, I think that certainly since the Paris Agreement, there has been a significant sort of step change in the financial world, but perhaps not directly to the point which you're making. I wanted to respond to the question by making the admittedly perhaps obvious point that it's not an either-or here. It's not a question of making progress on one at the expense of the other. It's a question of making progress on both. And that to pick up on some of the points that people were making earlier, you're making this point very much, there's a sort of nexus between these things. You make progress on one, and actually that helps you to make progress on the other one. So I think that's an important point to make. But just to finish off on your specific question, now I think there was a significant step change at Paris in the financial world in terms of, take for example, managers of funds under management and the extent to which they are taking account of climate issues. There was a real move there because up to that point this has been something which had basically been something which was the preserve of so-called ethical funds or whatever, and I think this has now become a much more mainstreamed part of the investment story.
Yeah, Verena.
Yeah, I think that we need to remember that climate change is the biggest global threat that humanity has ever faced. There's no way you can leave half of the population out of the solutions. And we're seeing that in those countries, not only on adaptation, but on mitigation actions, really seeing a difference. And the win-win solutions is how can you mobilize more than one of the SDGs at the same time, for example? How can you really, by empowering or promoting gender equality and women empowerment, you are going to really overcome climate change? Let us not forget that 70% of the decision of consumption within the household are made by women. So that is a tremendous power behind. And women has and should be seen as agents of change for the solutions of climate change. We have a tremendous power. We see it in the renewable sector on energy, really getting involved. The biggest wind solar farm in Thailand is a woman that has spearheaded it and conducted. And like that, there are thousands of solutions where women knowledge and women empowerment is making the difference to overcome climate change.
Ravi.
I agree, but I also think that we need to mainstream gender at different levels. And we've been working on how many women are there in the renewable energy sector. And we did a survey 2 years ago, and we're doing a much more massive one this year with a lot of stakeholders involved in the survey. We found that 35% of women represent are represented in the renewable energy sector. So that's much better than energy in general, which is around 27, 29, but it's lower than the economy as a whole, where you have in the 40% or something like that. So I think the multidisciplinary nature helps, and also the fact that the decision-making process is more decentralized, and that has a lot of ramifications. But I think there's a lot to be done in terms of mainstreaming, of introducing quotas. Sorry for those who are against quotas, but I mean, if you see, for example, that the Power and Utilities Index shows that there's 16% of women in the board as board members, even though the same study shows you that having greater diversity brings high return on equity. So there's a lot to be done on that, but of course there's also a lot of implication for education, training, which we can go into maybe a bit later on.
Sure.
Yeah. So I'd like to speak from the grassroots level, if possible, and answer like the aspect of like the long-term impact of like changing the mentality. I don't think it is as long-term as we assume it to be, because there are other models which have proved that women belong in the employment sector. One example is microcredit. Muhammad Yunus's Grameen Bank employs 98% of women, and it has played an important role in addressing the poverty issue back not only in Bangladesh, but around the world. So this is what I want to imply, and I want to share another story as well. When we go into different villages, when we first talk to the women, they first say that, no, they can't do it because they have never done it, and they belong in houses cooking. But once we train them, once we show them the pathway, and when they're able to realize that, no, they can actually do it, then you see the changes in society. People start accepting them within that society as well, because they then realize the power of women within the community itself. What is the only aspect that is missing right now for them is mainly the investment portion. Because you require a lot of funding to go into these channels, into the grassroots levels, to support these women. Yes, mentality and the gender gap is mainly a result of mentality and like some social aspects and like, you know, cultural aspects in different communities, especially in like countries like Bangladesh. But that can be addressed when like certain organizations, especially the grassroots ones, go into these communities and train the women on how they should, like, you know, be change makers in their own communities. So I think that is an important point to touch, that the long-term impact is not as long as it seems.
Exactly. There's another. You mentioned investments in your intervention. There's a question from the audience. Another dimension of the fight for gender equality is pushing for change in the economy. Development actors like United Nations Development Programme and the European Investment Banks have the ability to support women empowerment both in economy and on climate action area. What is the linkage between women's economic empowerment and climate change? Does Jonathan want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, at the risk of being a bit repetitive from where we were at the beginning, I mean, there's clearly at a sort of general level a link between women's economic empowerment and the positive things which can be done to help to combat climate change. We were talking earlier about examples where you know, women are in fact at the front line of the activities that concerned in the countries concerned, and so to the extent that their interests and needs are taken into account in the action which is being taken to help combat climate change, then plainly they will be able to contribute to that, and that is an important aspect of it. It's also an important aspect of it from the point of view of thinking about adaptation action, where the adaptation action is designed, of course, to combat the effects and the impact of climate change, and we need to be thinking about that too, and taking their interests into account there as well.
No. There was, Shah mentioned that, well, I mean, it might not necessarily take that long to change paradigms and to change people's mindsets about things. There's a comment from the audience that gender plans in conventions are not enough. Gender approach should be at the center of them, at least if we really want to change paradigm. Does anyone want to comment, or is this kind of stating the obvious? Lorena, did you?
100%. But you need to understand, when we started working on climate change and we went to the countries to say, well, we need to really incorporate a gender equality perspective, they said, well, we don't have a mandate. We don't have a mandate. now what we did is that we took those international mandates and we're applying it at the country level. We have no less than 25 countries worldwide that, thanks to those mandates that had been done at that international level, are being put into practice. Before, when we tried to access resources from the GEF or the Green Climate Fund, there was not a clear mandate to really look at gender within the projects. Now it is there, and believe me, it is making a difference. It's making a difference for us women from the South, and it's really opening the doors to areas that we weren't allowed. But we needed to have that higher level mandate, and I agree that is not enough. That needs to be applied, as Sean is saying. Those mandates and that new gender policies is just a step forward to really help and work with the women and the men, especially from the South.
Yeah. Randy, a question to you. We're seeing a lot of momentum, as you can see also from the audience questions, for gender equality and climate change. There was a time when neither of these topics were particularly mainstream, especially in the European or Western debates like this. What are your best tips to ensuring that the United Nations and other truly use this momentum now as catalyst for gender responsive action, to really capitalize on the moment that we have?
Well, I think just to link it with the conversation we were just having, the change that we're seeing now is that we no longer have to go to the effort to convince people who work, or policymakers who are working on poverty reduction or on environmental protection or climate change or disaster risk reduction. We don't have to convince them anymore that there's a linkage with gender equality. We've passed that point to some extent. They understand because we have these global agreements and because we've had these the SDGs that have really shown the interlinkages. We still have a lot of way to go to show them, okay, what next? What do we have to do? How do we actually bring gender into the work that we're doing on, for example, the nationally determined contributions and what, the other initiatives? We also, in the international community, are demanding in the national reporting against conventions, against the Sustainable Development Goals, against other agreements. We're requesting that countries show what they've been doing to address gender equality in their whatever instruments they're depositing. So we're starting, we have important roles, both to sort of start pushing financing to these multiple win investments that can hit a lot of the SDGs at once, to also start developing the evidence base of what works and what doesn't and getting that out there rather quickly, and then to start demanding accountability for results on these sorts of outcomes. And that's really, I think, the direction of the future, and that's what Sendai, Paris, and the SDGs have got us to.
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, I just want to say for the energy sector, it's not true at all. I mean, now, just recently we see movement, but it's almost as if, the energy sector feels that they have to say something about gender, but it's really not profound at all. That's why I think there's a lot, it depends on the sectors. It's very male-dominated, and there's a lot of work to be done already from a data point of view, but also on mainstreaming the gender aspect. Just to give you an example, the first study that is being done right now is by IRENA to show the impact of large-scale renewable energy projects in sub-Saharan Africa. So we've looked at a few IPPs and we're trying to see what is the real impact on communities with a gender perspective. There's no study like that has been done until now. So there is something to be had, and that's why, I was talking about quotas or looking content requirements that are absolutely necessary. For example, in projects that we do throughout the world through auctions, tendering projects in solar or PV or in wind. Sometimes certain countries require a local content requirement where you have to hire certain communities, have some local banking introduced, but also gender aspects. South Africa has been at the forefront of that, is really essential because it's purely dominated by a male perspective, and it's very, very hard to move things.
Can I just respond? I think this is exactly why we need a very strong accountability on the globally agreed, the global agreements that we have. And this is exactly why, because we need to start introducing what will bring about change and demanding that we have accountability, that change is realized. I would agree with you.
Jonathan, it often boils down to show us the money. So can you show us the money? I mean, what has your bank, the European Investment Bank, concretely done to empower women and promote gender equality? Could you give us an example of, for example, a recent investment project that you've...
Yeah, sure. We developed, I mean, just by way of background, I mean, we arrived at a gender strategy at the back end of 2016. You may say that was very late, but that's, anyway, we did it. We spent 2017 developing that, and now we're rolling that out in terms of the projects which we do and the funds in which we invest. And to take an example of funds, the Global Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Fund, so-called GREF, which is a fund which supports investments in those areas in emerging and developing markets, that has a very specific gender component in terms of the assessment of the projects which we are thinking of putting that fund's money into. But perhaps an example which is even, I think, maybe clearer for people to understand the implications of this. We do a lot of work on transport and mobility. And supporting transport is not just a question of enabling people to move around better. It's also a question of encouraging modal shift from bad transport, which is polluting or whatever, to good transport, to mass transport systems which are more climate friendly. And to give you two examples of that, we are at present working on a metro development in Bangladesh, in fact, and we're also working on a metro development in Cairo. And in both cases, there's a very explicit gender component. Why? Because on the sort of protective side, you could say, if women are going to be encouraged to use these transport systems, they need to feel safe. You need to take that into account. You need to build that into your planning. Think about what the challenges are. Think about what you can do. But then, of course, that then gives them the ability to move around, to move from home to work, to move from different parts of the workplace. It's good generally for the economy. So that's a concrete example, I think, or those are concrete examples of the way in which factoring gender in has a sort of direct positive result in terms of what we're doing.
But may I ask you, in the fund that you have, to which extent it really makes a difference in terms of investment? Because I know a lot of funds that do have a component on gender, but really, in reality, I don't think it'll make a difference in terms of investing or not investing, for example.
Well, that's a good question. I can't think of any examples within the ones which we're doing where it has a negative impact. Now, it's always rather difficult to prove the counterfactual when you're positively investing in things, and whether or not we would have done it anyway, which is, I think, the implication of what you're saying. I think the point is that we're taking it into account to ensure that gender aspects are properly dealt with in terms of what we're doing. I think that's the best one can say.
Lorena, Jonathan just mentioned some investment projects that have actually made an impact at regional level, at local level. If we want to see real action for women and girls in communities across the world, and not just on a micro level, but really going in the micro, macro level and going into the micro level, the strategies that we've been talking about and the strategies as all the institutions love to talk about, they really need to translate into actions. Something that Jonathan just mentioned, something that Shai is working on. What is your organization doing to support action at local and national levels? Can you give us some very concrete action?
Yeah, well, I told you about these climate change gender action plans. We have developed 25 now in various countries of the world. And it starts very interesting because it starts by building the knowledge on the women and women organizations and people working on human rights on what are the linkages between gender and climate change, and really identifying the needs. Because what happens is a lot of time climate change works on things like red. And when we go and talk to the women, they think it's a color and not a whole mechanism. So there is a great amount of time that we are devoting in really making that understanding. And then creating these gender-responsive action plans that look at the gender gaps in climate change and really closing them, and providing very concrete projects and initiatives worldwide. A water taxi system in Egypt, for example, that looks at the needs of the women on the different stops that they require, using new technologies that are produce less emissions. We have the proposal of Dominican Republic to have more women that are auditors for emissions of the planes. So these CC gaps reflect the needs and the voices of these women and these men in each one of the country, embrace the policies and the different strategies that they have, and are ready for the funding. But that is fundamental. The funding needs to flow down to that level. And we're seeing the financial mechanisms with good willingness to have gender policies, but access to resources still is not reaching what it has to reach. And that is that even though we have the great programs, and now we have all these great initiatives to be unfolded at the national level, access to resources is at the moment the big constraint that we have.
And that was something that I actually wanted to kind of bring this even more to the micro level, and Shah is the perfect panelist now to take us here and to build on what Lorena just said. You are the true expert on the action on the ground. Can you share with us some of the major hurdles that you have seen or that you've experienced that are preventing women's and men's equal access to technologies, for example? Mm-hmm. Can you share some of the experiences?
I'd first like to approach from the institution level of access. I think we had this discussion before as well. Yes. So the main challenges that, from my perspective, that my organization faces when working in grassroots levels is the amount of investment that is given by, for example, European Investment Bank, hypothetically. It will go to a larger organization like the UNICEF or UNDP or like ActionAid, these sort of organizations, but it'll not reach to like grassroots level organizations that are working deep inside the communities and have interacted with these communities on a much larger and a deeper scale. Mm-hmm. That is very important. We have to reach these sort of organizations. Yeah, it was mentioned about like, about providing tenders, right? For us to apply for that tender, we have to go through a lot of paperwork as well. Now, what matters more over here? The paperwork or the action itself? The action is being bared because of certain protocols that are in place right now, from larger organizations to smaller organizations. It's not going bottom up, because going bottom up, it's getting bottled up. So that needs to be addressed. And another thing, like the access to the gender gap that exists because of for technological access. Again, I'd like to stress on the mentality fact that a lot of these communities, when you're working in the rural level, there's a lot of religious and cultural difficulties. Like, for example, if you're trying to work in a rural community, then a religious aspect might come into like a competitive method with your idea in place that basically bars you from like implementing that idea, because that religious aspect will then challenge your aspect in terms of like whether women should be employed or not, whether they should be working in the field or not. So these are some of the things that we are working as well. And that's where we also need the support from like larger NGOs and corporations, because we are young organizations that are working from empathy. And we also need the support and the nurturing from larger organizations so that we can learn on how to properly approach such communities, and together in collaboration, then we can truly bring a difference in terms of reducing the gender gap that is existing in all of our societies today.
Ana Kaisa, can I say something to what Sean is saying? I mean, and we have been discussing this. There is another element. and it is that resources for women empowerment cannot continue to be micro. Small little chickens, pigs, and gardens. It's time in the climate change arena to move from that model of development. Yep. It doesn't work. It's just subsume women into the poorest of the poverties. It's just replicating it.
So, I'd like to just address that one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I completely agree with your fact in that scenario. But you should also, this is also something that we have experienced, that a lot of consideration is given towards these larger pictures. And when, for example, climate change negotiations, a lot of attention is provided over there. And because of that, some of these smaller aspects are neglected. It's the small things that matter as well. Both are equal in that sense. And that is the thing that I want to address. Yes, small chickens might not be that effective, but it is also making an impact that we need to realize.
I wanted to ask Rabia something. You're here representing the International Renewable Energy Agency, but you also work in the Global Women's Network for the Energy. We've been talking about, here many of the voices from big international institutions, from financial institutions. How do you see non-profits like the Global Women's Network for Energy? How do you see their role? Because they often come into the play slightly from the outside or from the outer circle. So how do you see their role?
Thank you. I think nonprofits can bring great support to this energy transition and bringing gender-sensitive policies, practices, and values. I've been in the energy world for a long, long time. And I started in oil and gas at OPEC. And believe me, I think I was 25 years, 30 years ago, the only woman around. And it was difficult. It was difficult because it was a male-dominated sector, because largely energy sector was perceived as very technical, so no women there. Already at the educational curricula are sort of designed for boys and men. There was absence of women as a role model to sort of find more balance. All of these reasons, I think, are what motivates the creation of networks such as the GWNet, which are really important in empowering, trying to empower women in sustainable energy. And as you know, going through this transition, people have this tendency of thinking energy transition, we have energy efficiency, we have renewable energy, therefore it's all going to be sustainable and it's going to trickle down to all these SDGs. No, it's not like that. In order to maximize benefits from this energy transition, we have to really be careful at all of those dimensions that we're talking about, be it climate, gender, etc. So the Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition is a non-profit international entity that was created last year to basically help in the energy transition by connecting women through all this interdisciplinary networking, advocacy, training, mentoring. And I myself, I'm a mentor, and I think this is what is needed in order to promote, at least in this context, but there are other contexts that need to be worked on in terms of empowering and mainstreaming gender. So for example, we do work on gender in terms of knowledge base together with IRENA. As was mentioned before, there is a huge gap in the knowledge that we have on socioeconomic benefits of this energy transition, and also including women. We're trying to fill that gap in order to inform policy making in a more rigorous way, which hasn't been done in a systematic way. But we're also looking at this mentoring programs, but networking back-to-back with major energy conferences like the Vienna Energy Forum, Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue, where really the dialogues are mostly between men. If you have 10% of women, it's already a lot. So we're trying to bring bring in this and mainstreaming gender in order to basically develop a culture of gender mainstreaming in the energy sector, including renewable energy, where it is a little better, but not far from being perfect.
We have quite a few questions from the audience, and I'm trying to select so that we have a good combination of people replying. The first, maybe, I don't know if Jonathan Rundy want to give it a go, given that you are from public administrations. There's a little bit of criticism towards public administrations around the world that they should improve a little bit the capacities to coordinate these policies and add coherence to get out of the silos, because, I mean, coming from an EU institution myself, I mean, we often have one service doing a little bit of this and another doing a little bit of that, and then there's everybody, I mean, we're kind of doing a bit of everything, but nothing really in a very coherent manner. So, do you want to comment this at all? Everybody's nodding.
I think you could, I can only agree to this question. I mean, I think that that coordination can always be done better. I mean, if you just take 2 or 3 examples in the related sort of climate space, you've got. You mentioned I do look after circular economy, I look after environmental issues, I look after blue issues, I look after green issues. Mm-hmm. These things all have their own little groups of people, big groups of people actually out there who take them forward, and sometimes without thinking as clearly as they should about the ways in which these intersect and the ways in which they work together. I'm sure you could devise a sort of Venn diagram with a sort of sweet spot in the middle where these things all work together. Not everything would be in there. So I think that, I think the short answer is that you should try, and as we were saying earlier, you should try and make sure that you get to the nexus so that you can tackle as many SDGs, for example, through one policy action as you can. And indeed, they tend to be mutually reinforcing, as we were agreeing. So it'd be possible to do that. But yeah, I can only agree that we can do more to coordinate this and make this better, not only between institutions, but within institutions.
Yeah. Randy?
Well, maybe I'll just add to that. I think that's really what the SDGs pointed out to us, is that we can't take any more of these sectoralized approaches. And as institutions, making this transition is a real challenge. And at UNDP, we're going through a pretty swift transition now to become more integrated in terms of our own capabilities to be advisors on any of the SDG from all angles, or to at least bring in the technical capacities you need, recognizing that you can no longer do this silver bullet approach. When it comes to, for example, climate change, we're working to support governments to meet climate agreements, for example, their nationally determined contributions, to bring in gender equality, women's empowerment, bring in the poverty, environment nexuses. We're trying to bring in all of these angles when we enter into a discussion that may be sectoral. So the goal is, how do you bring in the various issues you need to bring in, even though your entry point still may be very sectoral. And it's a big challenge because, that's how public administrations are organized. And for us at the UN, our counterparts, of course, they're organized in this way, but this is why educating policymakers to analyze from a multifaceted perspective and take holistic approaches is so critical.
The next question is something that Shah actually slightly touched upon in his previous intervention. And the question just highlights what a huge, very complex issue we're dealing with. It's actually directed to Lorena, but I'm happy for the others to contribute as well. How do bigger organizations such as IUCN take into account the cultural aspect of gender equality in your work on the ground?
Very much, but it's very interesting because we can hide behind culture to do not do gender equality. Yeah. And I always challenge my colleagues in the environmental sector. You go into a community and you bring new ways of generating energy. You are doing new ways of doing fishery, and that is culture and that is tradition. And you don't seem to be affected by those things. The moment that we said gender equality, culture, watch out, tradition. Yeah. Of course we do it, and we take it into account. But cultures are dynamics, and they have changed, and they're changing, and they're evolving. And that change needs to take into account the culture, but culture cannot be used as the shield that we can't do anything that attempts traditions. In the environmental sector, we're introducing change, and we're introducing changes in many other things. So what is the problem that we do it also with the cultures when we're talking about human rights? Because gender equality, at the end, is a human right. The right to participate, the right to make decisions, the right to own your body, to own the land, to own assets. So you can't have development that attempts against human rights. No culture can do that.
Shah, do you want to comment, or Rabia? Or?
I completely agree with her point. Like, society likes to stay within the boundaries of the status quo. Nobody likes to change, but it is when change happens, then society improves. So if we stay within that status quo, we cannot improve. And I completely agree with the point that you made right now.
Yeah. Then, moving on, various studies have shown that the involvement of women in decision-making drastically improves the management of natural resources by local communities. Do you have in your organization specific programs for balancing the gender representation in the governance of landscape management for multiple purposes, such as biodiversity, food, or climate change, etc.? So this would be for any organization that deals with land management, landscape management? Anyone?
Well, I can say that yes. I mean, those are part of our indicators. We really have developed a set of indicators and different criteria, and participation in decision-making processes and participation at all levels have very concrete indicators and then actions to mobilize that process. But sometimes you cannot put a benchmark of saying 50% of women, when you have 0 women participating in some of these decision processes, you require an investment. It's like having a bakery. There's going to be an important investment before you produce the first loaf of bread. So in our case, yes, we have very concrete benchmark and indicators in which all our initiatives and projects, not only for decision making, because sometimes it's not only the amount, but the quality of those that are participating in these processes.
I would just add that in terms of renewable energy, the advantage is the decentralized and local nature of some of the applications has helped sort of democratize the decision making. And we've seen that in the access context, but also in the modern context, where you have municipalities owning themselves or communities owning themselves the energy that is provided to a specific area. And that has helped, but again, we have to be careful that we don't fall again into some sort of concentration of power, which is one of the possibilities always in terms of the asset ownership, etc. But we have seen some really interesting things at the community level, but also in the access context, where those solutions, because they're small, local, and decentralized, help in a more decentralized decision-making process, where women can contribute as decision makers as well, because they're the first one concerned with the energy service that it is providing, whether it's in cooking or in electricity provision.
Okay, let's see if there is anyone in the audience who would like to ask anything. Yes, there we are. We have time for a question. Is there a mic going around? Yes, there's a mic.
The microphone is coming.
Just a second, there will be a mic.
The microphone is coming.
Yeah.
Thank you for the chance to make a comment. I'm not going to answer a question. I'm a former Minister of the Environment of the Republic of South Sudan and current Minister of Education. And I totally agree that climate change is the biggest threat facing the human race at the moment. And this means we need to take urgent action. But since this action is based on the existing laws related to climate change, whether it is UN Framework Convention or the Paris Agreement the issue of financing is going to be a big hurdle. And we need to, overcome this hurdle in order for women to participate in climate action and conservation of nature. I'm afraid time is not on our side, and we need to move faster. The wide range of actions that can be taken locally, there are many. In South Sudan, currently, we are introducing school environment clubs. And these are going to do, among other things, raise awareness about climate change and the importance of protecting the environment and sustaining the environment, as well as going outside the schools into communities to raise awareness of the communities and also to urge them to take action. But if there is one thing I am allowed to do with the Kyoto Protocol, I would sustain the provisions related to RED. I know a lot of people wouldn't understand RED or RED+, but RED is good for communities and can be one way of encouraging a lot of women and girls to get involved in climate action. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to?
No,
Everybody agrees again?
No, and I have to agree with the RED initiatives. A lot has been said and talked about RED, but we have good examples. We have Ghana, Uganda, Cameroon, and Mexico that have developed gender-responsive RED strategies, and they're making a difference. They're making a difference on land tenure. Thanks to the Cameroon RED work, now women in Cameroon can own land under their name, thanks to these processes. So I do agree with you.
Okay, audience, now for you, the following task. Again, using your app, we want to form a word cloud to round off the panel and the discussion. So what one word, and you're not getting any help, what one word comes to mind when you hear the phrase women and sustainable energy? And while the audience is at work, we are here today on an International World Environment Day, and we're spending it here discussing climate change, which is very good. I would like to do a kind of a rapid-fire round of last questions to our panelists today. Shah, if you could invite anyone here at this Development Days conference on women's empowerment, who would it be?
That's a good question. If I had to invite anybody at this conference, it would be one of those women who are facing directly the environmental disasters and climate change right now. Now, we have a lot to learn from them, because here we are in this panel talking about climate change, gender issues, environmental disasters, but how many of us have actually, come face to face with a cyclone, or have seen our houses being destroyed by a flood, or had to sacrifice that one glass of water for our child? Probably none of us. And that is why it is important to have those women participate in these sort of panels. So not only can we learn from their inspiring stories, but they can learn about the processes, about the larger processes of these certain protocols as well from our end. It can be a mutual exchange of understanding, and that way, through collaboration, we can do a lot more. That's why their participation in these sort of events is very important and very crucial for climate action.
Lorena, who would be your VIP?
Well, my VIPs, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I don't know if you have heard about the Parkland teenagers from Florida. Are these students that after a massacre organized a March of Our Lives. I truly believe in the youth, and they have the power to reject the old constraints and outdated conventions. And I wish they could be here so that they can be part of this movement, but hand over some of these processes. Youth has been cited in a lot of these initiatives. If you're not 18 years old, you cannot participate in UNFCCC negotiations, and we're discussing about their future. So those will be the people that I will invite.
Rabia, who would be your VIP?
So I'm going to jump 180 degrees, and I think I would love to have here the leaders of the traditional energy world, for them to listen to and learn from women, from men, from youth, and from everybody who is participating to make this world a better one.
Jonathan.
I would like to invite somebody from the past who had been involved, let's say, an early pioneer of women's emancipation or whatever, to see where we've got to. I hope they'd be reasonably impressed. I hope they'd also be able to tell us lots of things which we could do to make it even better.
Randy, who's your VIP?
Maybe I should say something clever, like someone from the future to come back and tell us that we've achieved all of our goals. But I would just have to say that I really agree with Shah, that the women out there who, whether it's in every day managing their water resources or their land use, or it's because of a disaster that has stricken, they are doing incredible work every day. And their knowledge and their resilience, which they have shown repeatedly, is really incredible when I have the fortune to meet them in my work. And I learned tremendous amounts from them, and that changed my complete paradigm. It shifts my paradigm on how I approach my work. And I think we all need to benefit more from those stories. So.
Okay, so these are the tips for the organizers for the next year's European Development Days for your VIP list. Can we already see the word cloud, or is it still work on the process? Not yet, not yet. All right, while we wait, one of the themes, or the theme of these development days is she's we, she educates, we grow. And I have a little story about Caroline Dama, who works in local communities to address climate mitigation and improve livelihoods, one tree at a time. She's a program director, and then all of these stories you can find both on Twitter and making rounds on social media. But she has worked with Kenyan children and adolescents to take climate mitigation into their own hands by planting trees. In 2013 alone, together they planted 100,000 trees in 90 locations near schools, faith-based organizations, and farmers groups throughout Kenya. She has also worked with rural farmers, introducing hand pressers for oil production from Moringa oleifera trees to help generate income while preserving trees that stabilize soils, protecting them from deterioration. As the member of the Koma tribe, which holds deep value for sacred forests, Caroline knows that forests mean much more than economic gains. And this is what she says: compassion is planting a tree whose shade you don't intend to sit under. Working with 65 primary schools, Caroline has built tree and vegetable nurseries teaching 3,000 children about the importance of living in harmony with the environment. So this is just one of the She is We stories that are making rounds during this conference. We're still waiting for the word cloud, I guess, or can we see it? Let's see what we have. So Agenda 2030 is quite high up there, future children and SDGs. Okay.
It's more a few wisps of mist than a cloud at the minute, isn't it?
All right, dear audience, thanks for being very active this afternoon. This concludes our session. I would like to thank all our panelists for a very, very interesting debate. Thanks to the audience, and enjoy the rest of the World Environment Day, and have a lovely rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna-Kaisa.